Hello, I'm Marnie Pratt, local history librarian at the Wood County District Public Library. Today is Friday, March 6th, 2015, and I'm speaking with Dr. David Elsass. I'd like to welcome you here with us today. We're speaking with Dr. David Elsass, and thank you for taking the time today to speak to us about your life and your experiences here in the Bowling Green community. Just to kind of introduce you a little bit, you received your bachelor's degree from Bowling Green State University. And then after earning your doctorate from Case Western Reserve, you came on board as an instructor of education at BGSU in 1960. You worked your way through the professorial ranks and eventually were appointed the Dean of the College of Education. And in fact, you were the first person to become the Dean of the college from which they graduated. You have also served 6 terms on Bowling Green City Council, with your terms dating back to the 1960s, and are currently an active member of Bowling Green's Exchange Club. So, as I said, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think I'd like to start with, since BGSU is such an important part of your story, I'd like to start with when you first came to BGSU. You started attending BGSU in 1946, and you were able to do so as part of the GI Bill of Rights after World War II. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that process, what that was like, and how perhaps that GI Bill of Rights was important to your experience.
Well, after the war ended, there were a number of us who had either been drafted the summer after high school or before we could go to college or complete a college degree. And the Congress passed a law that permitted the military personnel, when they were discharged, if they wanted to apply for post-high school education. It could be a collegial type with a baccalaureate degree, or it could be other types of post-high school. And it enabled a lot of young men to get an education. In my case, I'd been drafted the summer after graduation from high school. So I was 21 when I got out after 2.5 years, and was debating whether I was too old or not to go to college. And I did. I started up here then in the summer of 1946, along with, by the fall, probably about 2,000 GIs who came to BGSU and who had a little impact upon the enrollments at that time. Because prior to that, the university had about a total of 1,400 students, of which the vast majority were women. And it sort of changed the complexion of the university when more of the male GIs came into campus. So I chose Bowling Green primarily because it was directly 80 miles north of my hometown, and I had to go home on weekends. I felt I did to see a young lady, and so I could hitchhike and come back. And then the last 2 years we were married, and I graduated from it. But I came here when it was smaller. Now, I don't know how much more you want to know how small it was. I know a lot of the rules they had been developed primarily for the women, since it was primarily young women becoming teachers under a 2-year program that later became 4 years, but at that time was primarily 2. And there were probably about 1,400 here at the university when before the war, and when it ended, there were some of those, about 250 were here from a Navy V-12 or V-5 program, who were comparable to the one I was in of the Army of the ASTP. And actually there were probably about 1,000 women and only 100 male students who weren't GIs at that time. So it made quite a contrast to Bowling Green, the university.
What was the university like at that time? With I think the other day you talked a little bit about kind of the rules that were...
Well, they had a lot of rules that, for example, women couldn't ride in a car after dark with a man. Also, I think the women had to be in their dorms at 9 o'clock or some deadline like that. They had a number of those that the GIs didn't, they felt more mature and they didn't appreciate them. And frankly, some of those rules that they had as far as what you could do and couldn't do, when you could do it and so forth, were really a challenge. And some of them they were resolved, and some of them even persisted after the 1940s and into the 50s. But it was an interesting place, and the university had to expand. And I don't know if you wanted to know a little bit about the living conditions we had.
Sure, sure. You talked a little bit the other day about the barracks.
The enrollment between 1940, I think about 44, was, it had been about 1,400, including the Navy people. And then within a few years, it almost tripled. So one of the big problems was housing, and particularly for men. So one of the things they did, they brought in barracks from Camp Perry, and I know the 2 summers, my first 2 summers here, I lived with other former GIs in barracks that were out at the north edge of the campus, very close to where the Falcon Heights is at this time. And then also they brought in trailers for married couples, because that was a new thing for BG, that you had couples who were married, GIs and their wives. And they brought in about 40 trailers from the federal government. Well, I and 2 other fellows, we were having some housing problems. So one of the fathers of one of these, who was also from Anna, from my hometown, bought an old trailer and brought it up here, and it was parked right next to where the mausoleum had been, which is there at the west end of the cemetery on Ridge Street. So we were in that for the whole year of, that would have been 46, 47. And all the others were married GIs in that park. But it was rather unusual. And then my friend whose father bought the trailer went back home. And then that next summer, Mary Jane and I were married, and then she got a teaching job at White House, so I drove back and forth. But housing was one of the biggest challenges, and also for classrooms. They had a shortage, and they brought in some barracks for that. I remember the first 2 years that I took English classes, they were in a barracks right east of the physical education buildings, probably about where Olds Camp is today. And they were in those barracks, and they had one or two others to provide facilities. Mm-hmm. So you had a triple growth in about 3 years, so housing was a big problem.
Sure. Okay. So then after you finished your undergraduate degree, you left Bowling Green for a few years to work and pursue your doctorate. But then you returned for the teaching position in 1960. How did that come about?
Well, in 1960, by that time, I had been teaching at Baldwin Wallace for a couple years while I was working on my doctorate at Western Reserve. And an opening developed in the Department of Education at Bowling Green, and one or two of the administrators contacted me and wondered if I'd be interested in coming back. So we took the job, came back here in 1960, and as an instructor. And it was at the end of the administration of Dr. McDonald, and he was the man who probably of all the presidents made the most significant changes to it, but in the process he resigned too because of the build-up against what he had done, which turned out to be in the best interest, but weren't fully appreciated by everybody. For an example, I was an instructor. He interviewed me personally, and I knew that he was going to make the final decision. So then I came here as an instructor, and the next year I was asked to work in the dean's office as assistant to the dean, and did that, mostly advising, going out on the branches where we had a lot of students that were teachers who needed to complete their degrees, and did that, and various other parts in that, as well as teach classes and supervise student teaching. So that's how I got back here during that period. And I was here on, which was Dr. McDonald's last year. And when there was sort of a small rebellion against him by students and also by faculty. And that was rather a unique experience to see that happen. And it culminated, for example, they wanted to block Route 6, which was Wooster Street at that time. And on one occasion, some of them did go out. And another occasion, they were going to do that, and the State Highway Patrol came in. I remember seeing them break it up. So those were some of the issues that were developing that first year. After Dr. McDonald retired or resigned, then Dr. Harshman took over as acting president. So then we were into the 70s, and the latter part of the 60s, and that's when Dr. Jerome came here as president. And he contributed a lot to the physical structure of the university. That's one reason we have a hockey team.
When we took a break before, you were talking about your time at Bowling Green State University as a faculty member. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what you feel are your greatest accomplishments during that. I know you worked on a number of important things. What do you see? What are you most proud of during your time there?
Well, the small contributions that I was able to make during the university and in the College of Education, and of course it's not just one individual, but it's the support and the support from the administration, support from the faculty, and the fact that during the 60s and that time, we had the chance to develop some programs in the college. For example, for the mental retarded, as we called them then, they're developmentally, they have a different term for it today. And also in the area of the mental health, mental illness, and special education, those areas. And then we also had funds to get those programs, get them started at BG. We were during the time then of the anti-poverty program, and there were programs there that, in fact, for 6 months, they loaned me part-time to the governor's office, and I had the Northwest Ohio counties to work with the governor's office on poverty, and particularly educational programs. And one of the programs that we were trying to promote was the Head Start. And now that's about 50 years old, and they're still going. And there were others of that type. And we were encouraged by President Jerome to be involved. And we were one of the leaders in the state among the colleges of education in developing a lot of those programs. So I think those were very timely programs, and appreciated that opportunity. And then also I was given additional responsibilities in the college with program advisement, working with people, curriculum development and that part. And really it was a very interesting and good time to be with the university, and it grew. Okay. And it was during that time that Dr. Jerome had hockey come in. They built the ice arena. They built the new stadium, which was new at that time. They built the education building, and then the College of Business Administration building, and a lot of growth was done in that regard while he was here. He was a type of a leader that he would encourage you to do things, and you knew he had his support, and he felt his role was to be a catalyst and inspire other people. And it was a privilege working with him and with the other staff in the university at that time, in the 60s.
Something else that you worked on in your time at BGSU that is still kind of, from talking to you the other day, seems like something that's very important to you still is establishing the Little Red Schoolhouse that is still on the grounds at BGSU. Can you speak a little bit about how that came about?
Well, that, getting back to President Jerome, we had just moved into the new education building, and he visited us and was looking out of the window, and he said, "We need to have a Little Red Schoolhouse," and he pointed down there. And the reason was that BG started as a training program for elementary teachers, and the majority of them either came from or went to little red schoolhouses. And that was a major goal, and it was not only education, but they were in the rural areas. They were symbolic. They came out of the ordinance of 1787, which was very unusual, and said that every congressional township should have so many acres set aside for the preservation and promotion of schools. And that's how we began. And so he looked at Dean Jensen, and they looked at me, and they said, get one. So 6 years later, we got one. And we got from Norwalk, the people over there, a student whose family had a schoolhouse came in, and her name was Becky Linder, and said, you can have ours if you want it. And of course, Norwalk was 60 miles away, but we tried to move one locally, and they were fearful they would collapse. They had no interior partitions. So then Dr. Heisler, Dan Heisler, had 3 sons in college at that time. Dan was on our faculty and education, and they volunteered. They would tear it down, dismantle it so we could use the materials. And then the next thing, we needed money to do it. And Representative Wilkowski from Toledo attached an amendment to the first lottery appropriation in Ohio, and for $50,000 to help us do this. And we had not known, but he was a graduate of Bowling Green State University. He started out in a one-room school teaching in Michigan, and so we got, some of us had to go down to Columbus and appear before the legislature, and we were instructed to tell them that if we got it, the university would maintain it. So that's how we got it, and it's still there. It was used more than it has been, but a lot of times elementary classes come in and so forth, and it's a symbolic, remember, symbol, from where we came, what we did, and also to use for some practical purposes. So that's how it got here.
Okay, all right. Well, let's shift a little bit away from Bowling Green State University. You also have served 6 terms on Bowling Green's City Council, 4 of those during the 1960s and 70s, and then 2 more again in the 80s. Right. Now, initially you ran under the idea that the 2nd Ward, which is what you were representing, should no longer be considered second class. Can you tell us a little bit about that platform and why that part of town, which you also told me was known as Hogtown at the time, why was it treated that way?
Well, the 2nd Ward was the southeast quarter of Bowling Green, roughly from Main Street east and from Wooster Street south. And particularly the section, I mean, that was the 2nd Ward at that time. We lived out on Cherry Hill, and some of the people in town who were interested in government wondered if I would run for council, and they encouraged me to do it. My father had been in politics. I guess I had inherited some of it, but the point was that I was a university professor, and then a former professor of mine who was still active, Dr. Charles Burrell, he came to me, and he'd wanted to be elected to council at large, and he asked me if I would do it, and I sort of felt obligated, so I said yes, and I told my wife, Mary Jane, I said, don't worry, in Bowling Green, they haven't elected a university faculty member, and secondly, they haven't elected a Democrat since the 1930s, and I'm both, so don't worry, I'm doing it to help Charles. Well, we won, but I used the slogan, the 2nd Ward should not be second class. In part of the section of that ward, particularly east of the railroad tracks, there was an area called Hogtown, way back, and in that, even in the 60s, there were parts of that that didn't have sidewalks, they didn't have water, they didn't have sewer, and they were pretty much run down. And the streets weren't in good shape. So that's why I used that it should not be a second class, or it shouldn't be a second cousin. And we were both elected. And then there were other issues that came up during that period from about 65, 66 to the early 70s. And one was the students started moving off campus, and it was that part of town. And already at that time, we were getting concerns from residents about these noisy students moving into these houses next door to us. So it was an issue that started in that almost 50 years ago, when the university came to the point they weren't going to build a lot of new dorms. So instead, students wanted to live off campus too. At first, you had to be almost a sophomore, at least a sophomore, before you could live off campus in town and come to campus. Otherwise, you had to live in a dormitory. And so that policy was changed. And so, but here again, we still have some issues of that, and the southeast or second ward is one that has a lot of those. And then in that period it was starting, but in the 70s at Kent State, at that time when you had that problem in Kent where the governor sent the National Guard in and some students were killed, that week was very tenuous and very, I wouldn't want to relive it again here because I was on council and also an administrator at the university. And Kent occurred on a weekend, and late Monday or Tuesday of that week we got a call from the governor wanting us to close down Bowling Green State University and send them home. And we said we can't. And another incident related to that very quickly, there was a proposed rumor going around that some of the BG students plus outsiders wanted to go out on I-75 and close it down. And we knew very well that would give the governor more provocation to come in and with a guard and do the same thing. Luckily, a number of us, both city and administrators and faculty at the university, collaborated. So this term collaboration is not new. We collaborated and talked to some influential students and dissuaded them, then as a result, Bowling Green was the only one of the then 5 or 6 state universities in Ohio that did not have to shut down because of student unrest after Kent State. So that was something. And then again, then when I was appointed dean, I felt the two jobs were almost incompatible. You had it during the day and then again at night. And so I resigned in my 4th term. And then after 10 years as dean and a total of 20 in the dean's office, I decided I had enough of administration and went back to teaching. And then I was asked to run again for the 2nd ward, and I was unopposed. And that time we still had student unrest problems of a different type, but they were still some existing. They had one called Manville Madness, that there were demonstrations out this close to campus. And so that was still occurring at that time. But the tension of that during that period was something that I hope we don't have to endure again. Mm-hmm. So, but I was glad to be able to serve on council, and not only just for the 2nd ward, but for other parts, some of the issues we had. We had it on rabbits taking over. We had the issue over cats and a few interesting things like that. And some of them I don't think are resolved yet today, but we didn't get all of our business done. But,
well, it sounds like it was important. You were one of the first BGSU faculty members to serve on council. So it seems like that kind of dual role was important, and it proved to be important in the issues that came up.
And we've had representation since from the faculty over the years, which is good. And even Democrats being elected, because actually Bowling Green had been traditionally Republican. But yet my experience and others would say that the only time there's partisan politics at the local level is on alternate Octobers. That's the month before the election, and city elections are in odd-numbered years. The rest of the time, 90% of the issues are not partisan at all. Uh-huh. And so that was been interesting, and was glad to contribute.
So since you've been part of Bowling Green's community for such a long time, it has obviously changed quite a bit over the years. What changes do you see as most significant, either as part of the university or the town itself? What do you see as some of the biggest or most significant changes that it's gone through?
Well, the town has grown considerably. The university definitely has grown, although now it's been more stabilized. One of the changes that I see is that we've had more interaction between the town and the university. There were times early, when I mentioned back in the 60s and some of that, there were some feelings about sort of anti-university people. And I think that a lot of that has been overcome. I think that it's true with the students moving off campus, that has been a definite change. And now the southeast part has a lot of not only houses, but these bigger commercial dorms even that have been erected. But the university made a choice back in the 60s not to expand the housing on campus. And they maybe, I don't know if that's a regretful decision, because I don't think so. I think it was an inevitable decision that students wanted more independence, and it would have come about anyhow. But that was back in the 60s when that was decided, and very few dorms or anything like that were built. Now an interesting change where they're dismantling and rebuilding the fraternities. It's a little different approach than what they had before. I mean, they were there, but of course they were always on campus. They weren't off campus. And at times there were the concerns they were going to move off campus. So then who would govern them? So it's probably just as well if they are kept on campus. I think it's been interesting. I know we're very pleased that we made the decision to come to this community. I think we have among the better schools in the section. We've had a good relationship with the schools and the university, and we had some issues there that had to be resolved at one time, almost to the point where we were going to take all of our student teachers out of Bowling Green schools, and we got that resolved. That was when I was dean, and I think that's been a very good relationship. And I feel that it's really developed, and both the university and the city, and I'm very glad that I decided to come up old Route 25 and the Dixie Highway and come to BG.
Oh, well, it sounds like you've made some really important contributions. I think we're glad that you made that decision as well. Are there any things that we didn't get to talk about today that you feel you'd like to add about your experiences here in this community?
Well, there are, but I think probably we've covered it pretty well, as much, because it isn't what one person does. You have to work with others. And it's really been very, very fortunate to come here when I did, to go to school here when I did, to come back and join the faculty during that period of growth, and to also participate in the community. We've been active in our church. I've been active in several different clubs in the community, and it's a good place that we raised our family, and we have no regrets, and we hope it can continue to be that type of a community, both the university and the city. And I hope that it continues that way.
All right. Well, thank you again for speaking with us today, and we really appreciate your participation in this project.
And thank you.